Oscar Levant wasn't acting. He was suffering a literal nervous breakdown in front of the lens. MGM didn't call a doctor. They called it comedy. This is how Hollywood monetized his madness, filming his genuine panic attacks to sell tickets before discarding him like a broken toy. To keep him functional, they pumped him with addictive opioids. And when his genius became too dark for the screen, they used electroshock therapy to fry his brain, erasing the memory of the very music that made him a god. They didn't just break his mind, they erased his soul. In the summer of 1937, the sun was violently extinguished. George Gershwin, at the height of his creative power and at the tragically young age of 38, collapsed. He died shortly after from a massive, previously undetected brain tumor. The loss did not just break Oscar Levant's heart, it fundamentally and permanently fractured his psychological architecture. The suddenness and the specific medical nature of Gershwin's death introduced a lethal pathogen into Levant's highly anxious mind. He was completely paralyzed by the survivor's guilt. If George Gershwin, a man seemingly touched by the divine, glowing with health and vitality, could be suddenly struck down by an invisible silent mass growing inside his own skull, what hope did a neurotic, fragile man like Levant have? The grief mutated almost instantly into severe, unrelenting hypochondria. Every headache was a tumor. Every muscle twitch was the onset of a terminal disease. His obsessive-compulsive loops, previously manageable quirks, exploded into full-blown, debilitating panic disorders. He became obsessed with illness, physical decay, and his own imminent mortality. It is crucial to contextualize his suffering within the medical ignorance of the late 1930s and early 1940s. The psychiatric establishment possessed virtually no modern understanding of neurodivergence, clinical depression, or severe anxiety disorders. There was no vocabulary for what Levant was experiencing. He was drowning in a society that viewed mental illness as a moral failing or a lack of masculine fortitude. Men were expected to simply snap out of it. There were no selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, no cognitive behavioral therapy, and no compassionate understanding of obsessive-compulsive trauma. Levant was trapped inside a mind that was actively attacking him, and he was forced to fight the war completely unmedicated and entirely alone. To survive the sheer terror of his daily existence, he developed an aggressive defense mechanism. He weaponized his intellect. He used his blistering rapid-fire wit as a shield to keep people at a distance. He cultivated the persona of the cynical, bitter curmudgeon, delivering morbid, self-deprecating jokes to mask the fact that he was internally screaming. He learned that if he made people laugh at his misery, they would not look closely enough to see the genuine panic in his eyes. This was the fragile, deeply traumatized, clinically untreated man who eventually packed his bags and migrated to the West Coast in the 1940s. He carried the heavy ghost of George Gershwin and a mind completely ravaged by hypochondria. He stepped into the bright, sunlit world of Los Angeles, looking for work to support himself, completely unaware that he was walking directly into the jaws of an industrial machine that would look at his bleeding, fractured psyche and see nothing but unparalleled financial opportunity. When Oscar Levant arrived in Los Angeles in the 1940s, he stepped into an industry operating at the absolute zenith of its industrial power. The Hollywood studio system was not a collection of artistic collectives. It was an oligarchy of sprawling, ruthlessly efficient manufacturing plants. Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, the largest and most prestigious of them all, functioned under a rigid corporate doctrine. They owned the theaters, they owned the distribution networks, and crucially, they owned the human beings who appeared on their screens. Through the notorious 7-year option contract, actors were reduced to highly paid indentured servants. The studio dictated their roles, their publicity, their public romances, and their physical appearances. They built flawless, radiant idols out of ordinary people. But when MGM executives looked at Oscar Levant, they realized that his value lay not in perfection, but in his absolute visible brokenness. The studio system possessed a predatory genius for identifying what the public wanted before the public even knew they wanted it. In the post-war era, American and British audiences were exhausted. The psychological hangover of the Second World War was immense, yet the cultural mandate was one of relentless, enforced optimism. The booming middle class was supposed to be cheerful, prosperous, and aggressively normal. But beneath the surface of this manufactured suburban bliss lay a vast reservoir of unspoken anxiety. The executives at MGM understood that the audience needed a release valve. They needed someone to express the neuroses, the fear, and the cynicism that polite society had outlawed. They did not need another square-jawed leading man. They needed a scapegoat. They needed Oscar Levant. Levant had already tested his cynical persona on national radio programs, like Information Please, where his morbid, rapid-fire wit had made him a peculiar kind of celebrity. He was a man who famously stated, "I'm a controversial figure. My friends either dislike me or hate me." But radio was merely audio. The true commodification of his illness began when the camera was turned on him. When MGM brought him into the Arthur Freed unit, the legendary production team responsible for the greatest musicals in cinematic history, they initiated a chilling process of psychological extraction. The Freed unit was tasked with producing the 1951 masterpiece An American in Paris. The film was designed to be a triumph of color, movement, and joy. It starred Gene Kelly, a man whose physical vitality and blinding athletic optimism represented the pinnacle of the American dream. But a film entirely composed of relentless optimism becomes cloying. The producers required a counterweight. They needed a character to sit in the shadows, to scowl at the romance, and to ground the fantasy in a gritty, cynical reality. They cast Oscar Levant to play Adam Cook, the struggling, perpetually exhausted piano player. However, the writers at MGM did not invent the character of Adam Cook from scratch. They executed a far more insidious strategy. They observed Oscar Levant in his daily life. They watched his hands tremble as he chain-smoked. They noted his severe claustrophobia, his terrifying hypochondria, and his inability to maintain normal, comfortable eye contact. They listened to his morbid, self-deprecating remarks about his own physical decay, and then they simply transcribed his clinical depression directly into the screenplay. When you watch An American in Paris, you are witnessing a horrifying blurring of reality and fiction. The script was tailored specifically to weaponize his phobias. The studio wrote scenes that required him to complain about his health, to exhibit intense social anxiety, and to physically shrink away from human contact. They did not ask him to act, they asked him to exist in a state of distress while the cameras rolled. They recognized that authentic, unsimulated panic translates beautifully to 35 millimeter film. It carries a raw, visceral energy that a healthy actor simply cannot replicate. MGM monetized his madness. They took a man who was privately drowning in obsessive-compulsive loops and terror about his own mortality, and they framed his suffering as a hilarious character quirk. To fully comprehend the sheer cruelty of this arrangement, one must understand the physical environment of a golden age soundstage. The public imagination often romanticizes the classic Hollywood movie set as a place of glamour and magic. The reality was a harsh, physically punishing industrial factory. Filming in 3-strip Technicolor, the vibrant format that made An American in Paris a visual masterpiece, required an astronomical amount of light. The massive arc lamps positioned around the set emitted a blinding, humming glare. They also generated an intense, suffocating heat, frequently pushing the temperature on the closed sound stages well over 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Now place Oscar Levant into this environment. Here was a man suffering from severe sensory processing issues, crippling claustrophobia, and a nervous system already stretched to the point of snapping. The set was loud, crowded with aggressive technicians moving heavy machinery, and overwhelmingly hot. For Levant, the MGM sound stage was an interrogation room. The physical sensation of the heat, the blinding lights, and the claustrophobic proximity of the crew triggered massive, debilitating panic attacks. The complicity of the directors and producers in these moments is a damning indictment of the studio system. A director's primary objective is to capture compelling footage. When the heat and the sensory overload became too much for Levant, his physical symptoms would manifest violently. He would begin to sweat profusely. His speech would stammer. His hands, the very instruments that had mastered Gershwin, would shake uncontrollably. He would lose his grip on reality, entering a state of genuine, paralyzing terror. In a compassionate environment, a medical professional would be called. The set would be cleared. The man would be given the space and the medical intervention required to manage his psychological collapse. But this was MGM. Time was money, and the production schedule was God. When Levant froze in terror, the director did not call cut. They yelled action. They kept the cameras rolling specifically to capture his authentic breakdown. They knew that the audience would interpret his genuine trembling as a brilliant comedic choice. The studio effectively operated a high-budget freak show. They agitated a mentally fragile man, trapped him in a high-stress environment, and recorded his neurological misfires to sell tickets. The cruelty was not a byproduct of the production. It was the mechanism of production. When An American in Paris premiered, it was a colossal success. It won 6 Academy Awards, including Best Picture. The public reaction to Oscar Levant was exactly what the studio executives had calculated. The audiences roared with laughter. They loved the grumpy, twitchy piano player. They found his neurotic mumbling hilarious. The sociological transaction that occurred in those cinemas is profoundly dark. By framing Levant's illness as a comedy, the studio successfully conditioned the American and British public to laugh at the physical manifestations of clinical depression. The audience, burdened by their own post-war anxieties, found deep comfort in laughing at a man who appeared to be far more damaged than they were. They localized their fears onto his trembling shoulders. The tragedy of mental illness was sanitized, stripped of its horror, and served back to the public as light entertainment. For Oscar Levant, The psychological toll of this success was catastrophic. Consider the cognitive dissonance required to survive his reality. He was a highly intelligent, deeply sensitive artist. He possessed the analytical capacity to understand exactly what the studio was doing to him. He was forced to attend the premieres and watch his own panic attacks projected onto a massive cinema screen, while hundreds of people sitting in the dark laughed at his agony. This public mockery reinforced the most destructive voices inside his own head. His survivor's guilt over the death of George Gershwin had already convinced him that he was worthless. The laughter of the audience was the final, undeniable confirmation of that worthlessness. He was being paid handsomely. The studio checks were large and his fame was global. But the currency he exchanged for that wealth was his fundamental human dignity. He had become the court jester in a multi-million-dollar circus, forced to bleed for the amusement of the masses. The studio had proven that his misery was highly profitable, which guaranteed that the exploitation would only intensify. MGM eagerly cast him in subsequent musicals, like The Bandwagon in 1953, demanding that he repeat the exact same performance. The formula was set in stone, but human biology is not a piece of studio equipment. You cannot continuously redline a nervous system without causing structural damage. The panic attacks were becoming more frequent. The hypochondria was mutating into terrifying, irrational delusions. The sheer, exhausting effort of masking his terror just long enough to deliver his dialogue was beginning to tear his physical body apart. Levant was trapped in a terrifying paradox. He desperately needed the income to support his family, but the only way the industry would employ him was if he actively marketed his own psychological destruction. He was a man standing on the edge of a precipice, staring down into the black void of total mental collapse, while the most powerful executives in Hollywood stood behind him, adjusting the lighting, setting up the camera, and telling him to smile as he fell. The pressure was unsustainable. His mind was fracturing, and the physical reality of his constant terror was about to manifest in a catastrophic, life-threatening medical emergency that would drive him directly into the arms of the most dangerous, unethical sector of the Hollywood machine. The catastrophic physical collapse that had been quietly building within Oscar Levant finally occurred in 1952. The human body is not designed to endure a perpetual state of hypervigilance. You cannot sustain a resting heart rate that is constantly reacting to perceived immediate threats without eventually degrading the muscle itself. For over a decade, Levant had lived in a state of unmitigated panic, his nervous system redlining every time a director called action. The physical toll of masking his terror, combined with a relentless chain-smoking habit designed to pacify his hands, fundamentally compromised his cardiovascular system. At the age of 46, he suffered a severe heart attack. For a man whose entire psychological framework was built around severe crippling hypochondria, a genuine cardiac event was the absolute worst possible outcome. It was the ultimate terrifying validation. For years, his mind had falsely told him he was dying. Now, the physical architecture of his own heart had agreed. The heart attack did not just damage his cardiac tissue, it shattered whatever fragile mental barriers he had left. The fear of death transitioned from an abstract, obsessive-compulsive loop into a tangible, imminent reality. He was hospitalized, terrified, and in profound physical pain. It was at this precise intersection of physical agony and mental terror that the Hollywood machine introduced him to his ultimate destroyer, the Dr. Feelgood ecosystem. The historical narrative frequently attempts to dismiss Oscar Levant as a simple drug addict, framing his decline as a personal moral failing. This is a deliberate, sanitized lie designed to protect the industry that poisoned him. Levant did not seek out illicit narcotics in the shadows. His addiction was entirely legal, systemically administered, and medically sanctioned by the very people who were supposed to heal him. In the 1950s, the Hollywood elite relied on an exclusive, highly unethical network of private physicians. These doctors operated on the periphery of the major studios, quietly retained to ensure that highly paid actors remained functional. They did not practice preventative medicine or psychiatric care. They practiced chemical suppression. If an actor was exhausted, they were given amphetamines. If an actor was anxious, they were given barbiturates. When Oscar Levant awoke in the hospital, drowning in physical pain and psychological terror, these physicians did not offer him psychiatric intervention to manage his hypochondria. They offered him a chemical off switch. He was legally prescribed immense quantities of Demerol, a highly addictive synthetic opioid analgesic. The drug was highly effective at managing the physical pain in his chest, but for Levant, its psychological effect was a revelation. Demerol did something that no amount of willpower or cynical humor had ever achieved. It silenced the noise. The drug forcibly slowed the terrifying, blistering velocity of his mind. It chemically severed the obsessive-compulsive loops. For the first time since the death of George Gershwin, Levant experienced a few hours of artificial narcotic peace. To manage his severe insomnia and his escalating panic attacks, the doctors compounded the opioid with paraldehyde. Paraldehyde was an archaic, foul-smelling, incredibly powerful liquid sedative that had been primarily used in 19th century psychiatric asylums to subdue violent inmates. It was a chemical sledgehammer. The combination of heavy opioids and archaic sedatives created a lethal biological dependency. Levant was not taking drugs to experience euphoria. He was taking them to survive the waking nightmare of his own consciousness. The complicity of the MGM executives during this period is a masterclass in corporate sociopathy. The studio maintained strict morality clauses in their contracts, publicly demanding that their stars project an image of pristine American virtue. Yet internally, they actively fostered and managed Levant's addiction. They were fully aware that he was chemically dependent. The physical signs were impossible to ignore. His speech became slurred. His famously sharp, rapid-fire physical movements became heavy and lethargic. But no executive, producer, or director ever intervened. They did not intervene because a sedated Oscar Levant was far more profitable than a sober, terrified one. The drugs suppressed his panic attacks just enough to get him onto the soundstage. As long as he could be propped up behind a piano, hit his marks, and deliver his cynical punchlines, the studio looked the other way. The narcotics were treated as a necessary operational expense. The executives essentially sanctioned his chemical imprisonment, transforming him into a working junkie. He was caught in a brutal daily cycle. He required heavy sedatives to sleep through his night terrors, and he required powerful stimulants to wake up and perform the cheerful musical numbers the studio demanded. However, the efficacy of chemical suppression is finite. By the mid-1950s, the drugs could no longer mask the severity of his clinical depression. His quirks had ceased to be charming. The melancholia that the studio had so successfully marketed as cynical comedy morphed into a dark, impenetrable, and visibly disturbing reality. He could no longer reliably perform the upbeat, major-key musical numbers required by the Arthur Freed unit. He became erratic, missing shoot days and halting production. The moment his mental illness ceased to be funny, the Hollywood machine executed a swift clinical amputation. MGM, the studio that had extracted millions of dollars from his nervous system, immediately severed his contract. The termination was absolute and entirely devoid of sentimentality. There was no studio pension provided. There was no medical fund established to manage the severe chemical dependency their own doctors had facilitated. There was no loyalty. Oscar Levant had ceased to function as a profitable commodity, and therefore he was discarded. He was swept out the back door of the studio lot, a physically broken, heavily medicated man, left to navigate the brutal reality of Los Angeles without the protective infrastructure of the studio system. Abandoned by the film industry, entirely devoid of savings, and desperate for income to fund his escalating medical debts and his severe narcotics dependency, Levant was forced to pivot. He moved to the only medium that would still accept him: television. But the transition to the small screen did not end his exploitation. It merely concentrated it. In the late 1950s, Levant became a frequent, highly anticipated guest on live talk shows, most notably the Jack Paar program. Early live television was a unique, highly intimate medium. It lacked the glossy, edited perfection of a Hollywood film. It was immediate, unpredictable, and inherently voyeuristic. When Jack Paar invited Oscar Levant onto his stage, he was not inviting a classical pianist to perform. He was inviting a psychological train wreck into the living rooms of millions of Americans. The dynamic of his television appearances was inherently predatory. Levant was paraded out before a national audience, visibly unwell. He was often heavily medicated on Demerol, his hands shaking violently, his eyes darting across the studio, his speech a slow, slurred drawl. He had been stripped of his dignity and reduced to the designated licensed eccentric of the airwaves. The hosts did not protect him. They did not guide the conversation toward his brilliant musical career or his intellect. Instead, they actively baited him. They encouraged him to make morbid, self-deprecating jokes about his recent nervous breakdowns, his failing marriage, and his psychiatric hospitalizations. Levant, possessing no other defense mechanism and desperate to remain relevant enough to earn a paycheck, obliged them. He sat under the hot studio lights and offered his own destroyed mind up for public consumption. He would mumble dark, devastatingly sad assessments of his own worthlessness, and the live studio audience would erupt into genuine, uproarious laughter. The television network sold highly lucrative advertising space against the spectacle of a man actively losing his grip on reality on live broadcast television. It was a modern, televised iteration of Bedlam. The public was no longer laughing at a character in a movie. They were laughing at the real, unedited disintegration of a human being. They watched a man whose genius had once commanded concert halls, now reduced to a trembling, medicated court jester, forced to mock his own agony just to survive. But the darkest chapter of his life was yet to come. Stripped of the studio's protection and entirely consumed by his illness, Levant was about to be handed over to the brutal, experimental machinery of 1950s institutional psychiatry, where the medical establishment would attempt to burn the disease out of his brain with high-voltage electricity. The total collapse of Oscar Levant's private life was not a sudden explosion. It was a slow, agonizing structural failure. By the late 1950s, the man who returned home from the television studios was entirely unrecognizable. The heavy narcotics required to numb his panic had eroded his basic motor functions, and his untreated clinical depression had plunged him into a state of catatonic despair. His wife, June Levant, had spent years attempting to absorb the shock waves of his mental illness. She had managed his schedules, hidden his pills, and tried to shield their 3 daughters from the terrifying reality of their father's psychological disintegration. But a single human being cannot function as a dam against a flood of that magnitude. When his hypochondria mutated into severe, unrelenting paranoia, and his physical dependency on Demerol made him a danger to himself, June reached the absolute limits of her endurance. Stripped of the protective, albeit highly abusive shield of the Hollywood studio system, Levant fell directly into the hands of the state and private medical institutions. June made the agonizing, desperate decision to have him committed. He was removed from his Beverly Hills home and institutionalized at facilities like Mount Sinai's psychiatric ward. To understand the specific horror of what happened to him next, one must confront the barbaric reality of institutional psychiatry in the mid-20th century. In the 1950s, the medical establishment did not view severe mental illness as a nuanced chemical imbalance requiring therapy and targeted, compassionate care. They viewed it as a mechanical failure. The prevailing psychiatric theory treated the human brain like a faulty electrical grid. If the grid was misfiring, if a patient was chronically depressed, manic, or neurotically paralyzed, the doctors believed the most effective solution was to deliver a massive blunt force shock to the system to force a reset. Oscar Levant was subjected to the era's most aggressive, terrifying, and unregulated treatment, electroconvulsive therapy, commonly known as ECT. Modern ECT is a highly controlled procedure administered under general anesthesia with muscle relaxants to prevent physical injury. But the ECT administered to Levant in the locked wards of the 1950s was an act of profound medical violence. The procedure was raw, punitive, and utterly terrifying. He was wheeled into a clinical room, fully conscious and aware of what was about to happen. He was strapped down to a heavy table. A rubber bite block was forced into his mouth to prevent him from severing his own tongue during the violent convulsions. Electrodes were fastened directly to his temples. There was no psychological preparation. There was no anesthesia to spare him the trauma. The attending physician simply flipped a switch, sending between 70 and 120 volts of raw electricity directly through his frontal lobes. The electrical current instantly triggered a massive artificial grand mal seizure. Levant's body would violently arch off the table, straining against the leather restraints with enough force to fracture vertebrae and snap bones. The doctor stood by and watched his nervous system short-circuit, waiting for the convulsions to subside. When he finally regained consciousness, minutes or hours later, he was plunged into a state of profound, terrifying confusion. He would not know where he was. He would not recognize the faces of the nurses. He would often not remember his own name. This was not an isolated incident. The psychiatric establishment of the era believed that to cure severe depression, the shocks had to be administered repeatedly. Levant was subjected to dozens of these high-voltage interrogations over the course of his multiple institutionalizations. The tragedy of this treatment lies in its specific devastating impact on his unique intellect. The doctors claimed they were trying to cure his depression. What they actually accomplished was the systematic, permanent erasure of his identity. Oscar Levant's entire self-worth, his career, and his fundamental connection to the world were built upon his memory. He was a classical musician. His genius relied on his ability to retain and instantly recall thousands of pages of complex, intricate musical notation. He held the entirety of George Gershwin's compositions in his mind. He was a walking encyclopedia of literature, philosophy, and music theory. His rapid-fire wit was completely dependent on his ability to access that vast mental library in a fraction of a second. The high-voltage electricity did not target his depression. It targeted his memory. The repeated shocks violently burned through his synapses, destroying his short-term memory and shattering his cognitive processing speeds. The medical establishment literally burned the library to the ground. When he returned home from the psychiatric wards, the damage was undeniable and irreversible. He found himself struggling to recall basic conversations. The sharp, blistering intellect that had once intimidated the greatest minds in New York was reduced to a sluggish, fragmented fog. He was trapped in a terrifying cognitive limbo, possessing just enough awareness to realize that his genius had been forcibly amputated. He knew what he had lost, but he lacked the neurological hardware to retrieve it. Furthermore, the sheer physical trauma of the unmitigated seizures inflicted permanent damage on his most vital instruments, his hands. The man who had once commanded concert halls, whose fingers could fly across piano keys with a dexterity that rivaled the greatest musicians in history, was left with a permanent, uncontrollable tremor. The electrical shocks had damaged his central nervous system. When he sat down at the piano, his hands shook violently. He could no longer strike the keys with precision. He could no longer play the complex, rapid arpeggios of Rhapsody in Blue. The cruel irony of his institutionalization is staggering. The Hollywood machine had exploited his illness for profit, and when they were finished, the medical machine stepped in and destroyed the tools of his trade. They took a world-class concert pianist, a man who had dedicated his entire life to the mastery of his instrument, and they severed the neural pathways required to play it. They silenced the music inside him. Levant emerged from the hospitals in the 1960s, not as a cured man, but as a chemically and electrically lobotomized ghost. The depression had not been eradicated. It had simply been buried beneath a layer of cognitive ruin. He was sent back to his house in Beverly Hills, physically broken, mentally exhausted, and permanently cut off from the only thing that had ever brought him genuine solace. He could no longer play the piano, he could no longer remember the music, and he was left alone to face the final, quietest, and most devastating chapter of his life. The Beverly Hills home of Oscar Levant in the 1960s was not a sanctuary. It was a mausoleum. When the hospital orderlies finally discharged him, they did not return a functioning man to his family. They returned a casualty of medical violence. The high-voltage electricity had done its job. The terrifying, blistering velocity of his mind had been permanently slowed, but the underlying clinical depression had not been cured. It had simply been trapped beneath a thick, impenetrable layer of cognitive fog. He walked through his own house like a ghost, haunting the site of its own murder. The most profound tragedy of Levant's final decade was his awareness of his own destruction. If the electroshock therapy had completely wiped his mind, he might have found some measure of ignorant peace, but the procedure was cruelly imprecise. It destroyed his short-term memory and his rapid processing speeds, but it left his core awareness intact. He knew exactly what he used to be. He remembered being the sharpest intellect in the room. He remembered sparring with the greatest writers and musicians of the 1930s. He was a former genius trapped inside a broken machine, acutely aware of his own cognitive deficit. He was forced to witness his own intellectual decay in real time. Stripped of his ability to play music and physically incapable of enduring the blinding lights of television studios, Levant retreated entirely from the public eye. He became a severe recluse. He rarely left his bedroom, spending his days chain-smoking in the dark, heavily medicated on whatever prescription drugs his doctors deemed necessary to keep his remaining anxiety at bay. His wife, June, essentially transformed the house into a private hospice. She managed the barricades, keeping the press and the curious onlookers away from the wreckage of her husband. However, even in this state of profound physical and mental decay, the fundamental human drive to control one's own narrative remained. The Hollywood studios had exploited his illness for ticket sales. The television networks had paraded his panic attacks for advertising revenue. The psychiatrists had electrocuted him for a medical theory. Oscar Levant had been treated as a highly profitable guinea pig for his entire adult life. In his final years, he made one last desperate attempt to reclaim ownership of his own misery. Since he could no longer play the piano, he turned to the written word. He began to dictate and write a series of autobiographical books. The most famous of these, published in 1965, was titled The Memoirs of an Amnesiac. The title itself is a dark, devastatingly brilliant joke about the electroshock therapy that ruined his memory. The book was not a standard, sanitized Hollywood autobiography. It was a raw, chaotic, and deeply cynical examination of his own destruction. Levant understood the mechanics of exploitation better than anyone. He knew that the public still harbored a morbid fascination with his mental collapse, but this time he refused to let a studio executive or a television host dictate the terms. If the world was going to consume his tragedy, he was going to be the one charging admission. He wrote openly about his drug addictions, his time in the locked psychiatric wards, and the absolute absurdity of the entertainment industry. He used the last remaining fragments of his wit to write the punchlines to his own funeral. The books were successful, proving once again that his suffering was a highly marketable commodity, but the financial success offered no physical reprieve. The human body keeps a meticulous, unforgiving score of every trauma inflicted upon it. Levant had subjected his cardiovascular system to decades of unrelenting, unmedicated panic. He had flooded his liver and kidneys with massive quantities of synthetic opioids, heavy sedatives, and amphetamines. He had smoked hundreds of thousands of cigarettes to pacify his trembling hands. The biological bill was finally coming due. By the early 1970s, he was physically decimated. He looked decades older than his actual age. His heart, which had already survived one massive infarction in the 1950s, was failing. He was bedridden, struggling to breathe, and waiting for the inevitable mechanical failure of his organs. On August 14, 1972, the wait ended. Oscar Levant suffered a final fatal heart attack in his Beverly Hills home. He was 65 years old. The media reaction to his death was a masterclass in the exact type of cultural amnesia and superficiality that Levant had despised in life. The obituaries published in the major newspapers did not read like the tragic history of a medically and industrially abused genius. They read like press releases from the 1950s. The press remembered him exactly the way MGM had packaged him. They eulogized the curmudgeon, the wit, and the neurotic sidekick. They printed his most famous jokes. The cultural establishment entirely erased the systemic cruelty that defined his existence. They did not write about the studio directors who kept the cameras rolling while he suffered paralyzing panic attacks. They did not write about the unethical studio doctors who pumped him full of Demerol to keep him hitting his marks. They did not write about the psychiatrists who shot high-voltage electricity through his skull until he forgot how to play the piano. They boiled a complex, agonizing, and profoundly tragic human life down to a handful of cynical quotes and a scene from An American in Paris. Even in death, the Hollywood machine sanitized his corpse to protect its own legacy. When we examine the historical trajectory of Oscar Levant, we are not just looking at the tragic biography of a mid-century piano player. We are looking at the architectural blueprint for the modern entertainment industry's relationship with mental illness. Levant was patient zero for the commodification of psychiatric collapse. The executives at MGM proved that there is a massive, highly lucrative market for human suffering, provided it is packaged with a laugh track. They demonstrated that an audience will eagerly consume the visible symptoms of clinical depression, severe anxiety, and addiction. As long as the victim is famous and the lighting is good, we look back at the 1950s and condemn the brutality of the electroshock wards, but we rarely condemn the cultural appetite that drove Levant into those wards in the first place. The studio system did not exploit him in a vacuum. They exploited him because the ticket-buying public demanded it. The audience wanted a scapegoat. They wanted someone to bleed for their entertainment to articulate the dark, terrifying neuroses that they were too afraid to admit in their own lives. Oscar Levant was sacrificed on the altar of middle-class comfort. He was a man who possessed a brilliant, rigorously trained classical mind. He should have spent his life in concert halls, interpreting the great composers and expanding the boundaries of American music. Instead, he was forced into a golden cage, ordered to dance for the cameras, while his mind tore itself apart. He was surrounded by the wealthiest, most powerful executives and doctors in the world, yet he died completely undefended.